welcome. We were actually worried that the room will become empty by this time of the day. Not only given that we're almost the last panel, but also that you will not be tremendously interested in the topic, but some of you have stayed, so we're happy. Thank you. You know the panelists, they've been introduced. I just want to kick us off with a thought that came to my mind while walking out and in of this hotel, that we're moving between two realities, really. One is of sun and heat outside, the other is of darkness and chill in here. And that has a reference to what we're talking about here today, that is climate. We would most likely be sitting in the sun if we were to choose today, but we might want to sit in the chill in a couple of decades to come. As you see, or you don't actually, we want to ask in this panel about divisions and common actions of the West when it comes to mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And I wanted to ask our panelists first about your impressions when you saw the title of the panel, divisions or common actions. Do you think this was accurate? Are there divisions in the West? And we're moving here in a different dichotomy. This is not the West and the rest, but it's actually the global North and the global South. So we all sit here as the representatives of the global North, and actually you in the audience are too. So Geneviève, what did you think when you saw the title?
Yes, hello everybody. I am heading Europe Jacques Delors, which is the third Institut Jacques Delors in Europe after Paris and Berlin. Now, when I saw the title and listening to your questions preparing the meeting, I thought that the question is less a question of what is happening inside the Western camp. It's much more, in that case, a question of North, South, developed, not developed countries. And this is the major division, because the West can be seen as the part of the world which has emitted carbon dioxide historically for a much longer time. So we are the principal responsible of global warming. And the South and the developed countries, of course, have not contributed to this phenomenon, but are the first victims of this phenomenon. Look at the Sahelian countries, for instance, to understand this well. So I see less a question of divisions inside the West. We are pretty much aligned in responsibilities and in answers to the phenomenon than necessity to understand well our responsibilities and to be up to this challenge. When we speak about climate change, we very much speak about mitigation. So how to diminish our CO2 emissions, and we do not sufficiently speak about adaptation. We are more and more facing everywhere in the world, even if certain regions of the world are more affected than others, we are more and more feeling the effects of climate change and the necessity to adapt to these effects. Look at coastal areas, for instance. Look at aridification in many countries. And all of this must be tackled, and we can find solutions to resist the changes, probably not on the long term, but at least to facilitate the transitions.
So we'll move to the details on that a little later on. You see more commonalities, no divisions, more common action within the global north, within the West. Georg, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. I would like to link your question back to the discussion that we had before, and the discussion we had in the past 2 days was very much focused on the Ukraine or Russian invasion in Ukraine and the implications of that. And I think it's extremely relevant for the climate discussion as well, because this year and next year, the unity of kind of the West will be needed to be remained and kind of re-established, reaffirmed in order also to tackle the climate crisis. So we should not kind of for certain climate goals that we are having throw out international order considerations on Ukraine. And I think we really need to keep the priorities right here. And my point would be that international law, making sure that there's international cooperation, keeping international institutions is crucial, and that's why we need to defeat Putin in Ukraine in order to stand a chance to get ahead with our climate agenda. And why I'm saying that is because there might be a couple of trade-offs that we are confronted with in this climate versus security world. There is the question, should we burn more coal in this and next year in order to be independent from Russian gas, which is bad for climate but gives us the independence? Should we try to see in terms of food production whether there are some things that we need to do now to protect kind of the world against the food crisis, even though that's not entirely in line with our European Green Deal long-term targets. So I think there are challenges and trade-offs that we are facing now, and I think preserving the international institutions here is crucial to get the long-term climate goals. And the second element of that is European unity. In terms of European unity, it needs, I mean, we need to stand together on those things, and we have institutions that we build up in Europe, such as energy markets, to make sure that the energy is freely flowing within Europe, such as a European carbon trading system, such as joint climate targets, and we need to protect those in this crisis. And they will become increasingly challenged in the next weeks, months, and so on, because if Putin stops exporting gas, if we stop importing oil, there will be huge turmoil on the European market, and it will affect different member states extremely differently. And it is not going to be a cakewalk. It's really going to be dramatic for each individual member states. And if we do not manage to preserve the European institutions over this crisis by throwing it out due to populist demands, then our entire climate architecture that we built for 20 years, emission trading system as a main example, is going to fall away, and we will have nothing. So really keep the institutions intact, both the international ones and the European ones, even so we have a crisis, and defeat Putin.
Thanks. It reminds me of what François Heisbourg said in his keynote the prior evening when we started the conference. He actually said that his dream, I will not repeat his words exactly what he said, but he said that his dream is actually for Putin to cut energy supplies to everyone. That would unite Europe, that would unite the West immediately. Okay, but we'll move to the war in Ukraine in a little bit. Zuzanna, your thoughts about the title, Divisions or Common Actions?
You used the word dichotomy. This question about actions and divisions brought to my mind other words. I would rather speak about duality or duplicity. Some even call it hypocrisy, unfortunately. Starting from what we have in common, I would say that none of us in any part of the world is able to hide from climate change. So this is something that we all have in common wherever we are. The second thing is that we very well know where we have to go and how to achieve it. But that's the famous quote from Matrix. There's a difference between knowing the path and going the path. And this is where the divisions begin. We tend to see the West, or the North, as you wish, as a big bloc of like-minded countries that will act commonly for the common and the single purpose. But at the very end, very often, we've got national interests, national egoisms, national problems that prevail over the fate of mankind, of humanity. This might sound a little bit, maybe with a lot of pathos, but in reality, this is all about it, about the mankind and humanity and the role of humans on our planet. I am far from being an ecological activist. I am analyst for energy and climate, but also my own perspective is that we don't pay enough attention to our actions. We pay a lot of attention to what we are saying. And we've got all the bureaucratic processes, we've got procedures that instead of helping us to reach precise goals that we have all in mind, in fact allow us for hiding our real activities. Just to name our capacity to hide biomass in the statistics related to renewable energies. We have a capacity to hide gas and Nord Streams in our statistic related to green transformation. We've got a capacity to include nuclear energy in statistics also related to environmental issues. We are very good in manipulating data, and this is something that we are doing very well all around the world. This is one point that we have in common, but the fact is that we are just trying to cheat a little bit. We are trying to, one country is trying to be smarter than the other country, but at the very end it is all about nature, and we cannot outsmart nature.
This is big for a beginning, good. So moving back to the war, I'm thinking about politics in the way that there's some kind of a dialogue between the structure and the agency. The structure being the government, big institutions, the agency being individuals, NGOs, that kind of bottom-up pressure. So we're in a totally new reality after the 24th of February with the war in Ukraine. And where does climate crisis fall in that? I mean, in the perceptions of people and in the interests of governments. Because on the one hand, you have a temptation to think about hard security threats only these days. This is the immediate threat, this is the immediate goal, this is our immediate interest. But at the same time, the European Commission has just announced 200 billion euros to reduce dependence on Russian oil, mostly investing in renewables. Of course, there's this coal component. I hope Georg will talk about that more. So, in a nutshell, will the war in Ukraine slow the green transition or vice versa? Who wants to take this?
The objective of the communication that the Commission has adopted 2 days ago, Repower EU, is precisely to answer to this question in a positive manner, to make this crisis an accelerator of the green transition. 85% of Europeans consider that we must get independence from Russian fossil fuels. It could be 100%, it is 85%. However, it's a very big majority. And we can build on this desire of independence from fossil fuels from Russian fossil fuels to accelerate the transition. We must also understand that even if the dependence from Russian fossil fuels has revealed itself to be a terrible threat, any other dependence in certain regions of the world would not be better. So, what can we do? What shall we do? And this is something that the Jacques Delors Institute had advocated for, and which is now on the table of the Council and the Parliament. we must, of course, accelerate the efficiency gains. It's about sobriety, it's about behaviors, it's about technologies, and the aim which is set by the Commission is to accelerate the gain from 9% to 13% at the horizon of 2030. So it is acceleration. They propose the same acceleration for renewables. Get from a goal of 40% in 2030 to a goal of 45%. So you see that the answer is acceleration. The Commission also proposes diversification of imports. But if it is a simple diversification, this would certainly not be as such so good. So we must first look at from where we diversify our imports, and also under which conditions. And one of the possibilities which is foreseen by the Commission is to have partnerships with countries in the southern part of the Mediterranean, and to accompany them in their transition towards renewables. So we can start with a contract for providing gas, and then have an evolution with them in partnership to encourage with the money that they get from gas export, encourage them to go to renewables. One more data that can be interesting for you. There is 3 times more solar panels in Sweden than in Algeria, because Algeria is in a certain way victim of its resources in gas. So that's the kind of partnership that would be helpful for everybody.
This sounds very tempting to go this way, but I'm thinking about Egypt, for example, 100 million people, and they have a gas field, a large gas field, a couple of fields. They sell us gas, but I worry that they will not be encouraged to spend this money on renewables, since half of the population live below the national poverty line. So sure, it might be interconnected and it might be done. I don't want to discredit that offhand. But Georg, what about your take on the Commission's idea and actually the impact of the war in Ukraine on the green transition?
Quite boldly put, I think we think too little about the next winter still. My real worry is that we are not prepared for a complete cut of Russian energy in the coming winter. And this is a potentially strategic mistake. At least that's, as an economist, my understanding, because the effect of such a cut, if it's unprepared, would be that essentially some countries in Europe would have some energy, they would have to share, and all this needs to be very well prepared, because it will be scarcity all over Europe, and it will be a really big supply crisis. And we need to get the institutions ready, and the proposal that the Commission has been making on the short term about we stop the price mechanism will essentially mean that every country that has energy will stick to its energy, will not share it with its neighbors, and that will very strongly push those countries in the East that are highly dependent on Russia to make compromises on the Ukraine strategic situation. And I think that is stupid that we are still not on track of finding stronger coordination here. We think, my thinking is we should very strongly compare kind of distinguish short-term and long-term. What the Commission has done is proposing more of the long-term stuff to be done in a shorter period of time and do it more strongly. And I applaud that. I think it's largely the right approach. But the short-term is where the big difficult trade-offs are, where we have to question ourselves whether the Netherlands produces more gas, which will cause little earthquakes in the Netherlands, and the Dutch population does not want that. Where we have to ask the Germans to run their nuclear plants a bit longer, because that's where the energy is, can come from, because it's potentially available. We have to ask the French to build this interconnector over the Pyrenees so that we can get the liquefied natural gas out of Spain onto the continent, where we have to ask the Poles to open electricity trading with Ukraine to potentially import electricity from Ukraine to have more energy available for the continent. There is a lot of stuff that we can do. I mean, the numbers, if we put them together, they fit, but we are not doing it. We are still sitting on our hands because everybody is afraid of their political fallout of these decisions. And there are, of course, also some climate-related issues like burning more coal, using the lignite plants more. But the alternative to that, just buying more LNG, first, it's limited, and second, the LNG that we are buying here means more coal being burned in Japan and Qatar, or in Japan or South Korea. So it's not saving the climate if we are kind of replacing our coal production with LNG imports in the short term. So my plaidoyer at that moment is focus most strongly on getting this short-term thing right. There needs to be painful decisions by all member states being taken. They need to put heads together about sharing of the cost, because the cost of this thing are going to be huge. And then on the long term, but we might discuss that also later, I'm a bit afraid that a lot of the proposals that have been circulated also at this conference are looking back into the 1980s. We don't need to go back to the 1980s for energy security. We can go to the 2100s in terms of energy security, meaning more renewables. We don't need more nuclear and coal plants in the long term, but in the short term, we need to bring everything to the front that is needed to potentially sustain a blackmail from Russia.
But if we're not doing it now, when the urgency is so big, you know, there's war, we have all the IPCC reports, we know what's happening, then what does it take? I mean, can you explain that? I mean, what would it take to build those interconnectors, to send electricity to Ukraine, to build this tunnel through the Pyrenees?
Well, I'm not a policymaker and not a politician that has to balance all these different interests. I think we first need a sense of urgency on this matter, and the sense of urgency is not yet there. I think we have no sense of urgency about the supply cut in winter. My government in Germany is not kind of communicating to the population that there is a huge strategic risk on the horizon. The government in France is not kind of communicating to the population, we need to save gas now, we need to save electricity now to have more gas in storage for the winter. We are not preparing for this contingency, and because it's convenient to hope that the war ends one way or another, but then we might be in a situation that we are skeptical to blackmail. And there is politically, it's a paradox, it's a prevention paradoxical situation. If we prepare, and if the storages are full, Putin will not cut, and we will look stupid. If we do not prepare, Putin will cut, and we will also look stupid. So for policymakers, it's a very, very unfortunate situation, but we need to help them to get out of this situation, and they need to communicate to population that this is the situation we are in.
Okay, hopefully this clip on YouTube gets viewed 30 million times. Zuzanna.
I share both opinions. This is a matter of cost of action and cost of the lack of action. This is a matter of the sense of urgency, whether we prefer short-term shock or maybe long-term suffering. Both might happen, and the problem that I see as the most important right now is that we do not know much. We have volatile energy prices changing all the time, depending on the tweet of some decision makers and politicians. We hope, of course, for the end of the war, but we don't know the terms of the end of this war. We are totally uncertain about this next winter, and we are even more not certain about the future in the next years and this longer term that the European Union is announcing in quite bright light. We have the big question mark on determination of the global countries, or all the countries in the world, the parties of the UNFCCC, to deliver to their commitments after COP26 and before the COP27. We have a total suspense when it comes to the fate of Russia, what will happen with Russia, and with which Russia we will have to deal in a couple of years, and whether we will be able to take advantage or not at all, because maybe we won't need them of their energy resources. I would say this war in Ukraine gave us an opportunity to rethink the energy and climate aims that we had. But this is just one of the variables that we have in our energy and climate equations. We have a lot more problems than just dependency on Russian energy resources. And right now we are just tackling this one little issue. But we are dependent on imports of energy from other countries, not that democratic neither. We've got the problems of technological progress that makes us not able to use the full potential of renewables. We've got many, many other problems to tackle. So this is just the beginning of the story.
Right. There are questions coming in through social media that do relate to imports of energy from Russia and the war in Ukraine, the role of Ukraine actually in the European green transition, but we'll move to that later on so that we don't just focus on that. But Geneviève, you have mentioned actually this global North's responsibility for what happened with the climate. So just so that the audience knows and we're on the same page, the United States has emitted more carbon than any other country to date and is responsible for 25% of historical emissions. Next in line are the 27 countries of the EU plus the UK, which are responsible for 22% of global CO2 emissions. China's historical contributions are estimated to be around 13%, India 3%, Brazil 1%, and the whole of Africa 3%. So how do we put our responsibility to practice, is my question, to you specifically. How do we make up for this climate injustice that we have caused?
For the ones who have followed Glasgow, you have seen that one of the main controversies was about climate finance. Because in Paris, in 2015, developed countries had committed to provide developing countries with $100 billion per year of climate finance. And this has not been respected. So one of the conclusions of Glasgow is that the developed world has renewed its commitment and will aim to reach this target by 2023, so next year. And also, what we have seen in Glasgow is a request from developing world to have more aid for adaptation, because they are experiencing more and more the effect of climate change, and they have urgent needs of this kind of support. But beyond which can be considered as a public aid, there must be a lot of private finance targeting ecologic transition, not only in the developed world, but elsewhere. And the technological breakthrough that we can experience in renewable energy, for instance, should be applied in the developing world. And also, as I said previously, the kind of partnership that I mentioned. And I want to come back on the objection you had about the acceptability of this shift by poor population. We should not see it, and we should really aim at contradicting the idea that this shift would be an aggravation of poverty. And especially in countries like Egypt, where aridity is progressing fast and when temperatures are rising fast, the climate change is provoking even more poverty in this country. So this is something that we have to keep in mind, and also that new technologies bring new competencies, new employment opportunities, new market opportunities, and certainly we need to accompany these countries during the transition, but it is not a transition to more poverty. It is a transition to at least the same level of prosperity, but hopefully, and this is the aim we must set ourselves, to more prosperity.
Agreed, definitely. My point was not to say that it would aggravate poverty, but that there are more urgent priorities for a country such as Egypt that cannot feed a population of 100 million people because of the shortage of wheat and all that. But no, technologies...
Sure. Just a word, because I was born in Tunisia and I go to this country very, very often. Tunisia is 75% arid land and in course of being even more arid. People understand climate change and people understand the urgency to fight climate change.
Certainly. No, I do not think that they do not understand. I think they understand much better than we do. Georg, any thoughts on the climate injustice?
Yes, no, I mean, climate change is an issue that can only be resolved globally. Other countries have a right to develop economically, and they cannot, for planetary boundary reason, develop in the same way as we did with hydrocarbons. So we need to open them a way to economic development without burning oil, coal, and gas. And I think Europe, maybe the West, have a big strategic opportunity here, because I mean, China with its Belt and Road Initiative reaching out to countries and soft power about infrastructure, we can do the same thing with low carbon technologies. We have the technology in Europe. We are very strong on that. We have cheap capital, which is something that those countries are missing. So if we would go to places, India, Africa, developing countries, emerging countries, and make them an offer and say, okay, we are offering you technology, money at good terms, if you do the following: not just buy Siemens wind turbines and install them there, but install a regulatory framework in your country that allows you to build wind turbines and build solar panels from the market in a very transparent way. Things like, we had a plan for Ukraine. I've been working for 15 years in Kiev lately on a project called Low Carbon Ukraine, where the idea was, you set up a climate fund. This climate fund is filled by your domestic carbon price. This encourages Ukraine to build up a carbon price, and we match this from Europe, €1 for €1. Each euro that you collect in Ukraine from the carbon price, we give you an additional euro, and this money is then used to build these renewable projects that you want, and on top of that, you not only have the wind turbine and the carbon pricing system, but potentially also the regulation for your energy market. Because we need to think this bigger. It's not that we are going to just install Siemens wind turbines in Africa and the problem is going to be solved. We need the institutional foundations, which kind of brings me back to this, to the initial point of a lot of the discussion in the conference about Ukraine's future. We need really to think about institution building. It's not only about money and hardware, it's very strongly about institution building. And here we need smart ideas. Here we need strategic ideas, because that's where the strategy is going to be coming from, because that's the long-term development of the country. It's not the number of bridges and wind turbines, it's the institutional software of the country.
Zuzanna, before it's going to be over to you, I have a feeling that you, Georg, you answered this question, but perhaps you have something immediately to add. So how do you perceive the role of Ukraine in the European green transition? Could it play a significant role in it, and at the same time, may it become a way to support the rebuilding of the Ukrainian economy? So I guess this is the idea, right?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, Ukraine would be a great place for Europe, and also for the strategic considerations of Europe. I mean, if we are looking at Ukraine, we are seeing a country that in the past has invested in dirty, heavy industry and was a bit problematic. But if we think about the challenges of the 21st century for Europe, that it will be food and land and energy and all that Ukraine can provide in an environmental sustainable way. So if we help Ukraine to develop that, it could be an excellent contribution to the European economy, and integrating them into the European market would be a great benefit to everybody from Lisbon to Luhansk.
Sounds rather brilliant. Zuzanna?
When it comes to the question on Ukraine, of course, I perfectly share Georg's opinion about the special place that we have to give in our energy system for Ukraine, with its resources, with its capacities, with its potential, and ability, and especially willingness to help us to contribute also to the development of the European energy system. So we have to keep that in mind. But coming back to the question of climate justice, you both were saying quite a lot about institutions, and I will once again bring it to the other end of the topic, because climate justice as such is not just the issue of it's not a technical question of emissions, it's not the technical question of infrastructure, it is not just that. These are all important tools, but this is also about human rights, about social responsibility. This is about simply people, because we've got workers, we've got consumers, we've got businesses, we've got communities, taxpayers, voters, etc., etc. They all have a word to say. They are partially responsible and partially kind of the solution to the climate problem that we have. So we have to keep in mind also this human factor and human dimension. And also, for me, climate justice as such is a matter of how to speak about responsibility for the past. And on the other hand, we've got this just transition.
Poland.
I didn't want to say it. We've got just transition and the issue of just transition and how to think about the future. So maybe we don't have to oppose those both ideas, both terms, but myself, let's say as rather a younger generation, I tend to think about the future rather than the past.
Thanks. So we have 17 minutes left. Let me just get a feeling if there's any interest in the audience to ask questions at this point. If not, I have plenty of them myself and from social media. Okay, there is interest, good. But just, Melissa, I'll keep you waiting for a little while still, because I don't want the audience to think that we're omitting or evading questions about coal here or Poland. And we do have a problem in Poland, right? We need to phase out coal. And I have a question to Zuzanna and Geneviève, but Georg, you're also welcome to answer. I would love that. So I'm under this great impression of a small town in northern France. The name is Luzon-Goël, so that's somewhere in, that's 7,000 inhabitants, okay, really small. But once coal shaped this town. Its housing, its inhabitants, its social and economic structures, even the landscape, because the largest two piles of coal in France were just there. But Luzon-Goël used to be heavy dependent, and it now actually has become an experimental hub for energy transition policies. It's got a green mayor, but actually, instead of suppressing its mining history, it has learned to live with it, and solar panels are now installed on those remaining spoil tips. The town is completely green and uses renewables. So I wonder, how did France do it on the social level, okay? I'm not talking about nuclear energy because you have sufficiently enough energy. But how did you do it on the social level? Any clues or recommendations for Poland, you know?
Okay, thank you very much. I do not know this village. However, I've been in Katowice for the COP. And when you are in Katowice, you feel coal in the air. You see coal on the facades, and you understand what a coal region is. And when you know that it is 5 million persons, and it is there for decades or more than a century, you understand that the transformation is extremely difficult, that it will be very costly, that it will be very long. But at the same time, it was a great symbol that the COP was taking place in Katowice, which means that there is at least an awareness of the need to change. And everything begins with that awareness of the need to change, and then how to do it. And then you must have a plan of reconversion and reskilling. So it means new activities, new competencies. It means education, it means training, and it means development. It means new technologies and so on and so forth. So it's a plan. You have to, first of all, have the will, and I guess it is clearly the case in Poland, and then have the means and a roadmap to get there. And I think that in France we did the same, except that, first of all, our regions, our core regions, were not so important, and we did it some decades ago. So, well, what you will have to do now, it's at a large scale, but with I think that the means are there.
The means are definitely there. Our transition is going on slowly but steadily, with pain, but still it is going on. We are one of the countries in the European Union that is developing its photovoltaic sector in an extremely rapid way. We are still improving conditions for other renewable resources. I would say that there is tiny little one good point about the war in Ukraine when it comes to energy, because thanks to the situation, we have a new light brought on the issue of renewables. Previously, they were part of the big discussion whether we should concentrate on climate change or energy security. And the renewables were in the camp of climate change mitigation. Right now, renewables moved rather, or also, towards the solution of the problem of energy security, even though they are intermittent, and there are problems with their implementation due to some technical issues and the capacity of our network to absorb more of renewable energies. Still, this becomes part of the solution related to the question of energy security. It's not just coal, it is also right now renewables. And when you think about it, we often discuss the issue of miners and the whole industry of coal. Just to let you know, mining sector right now, it's about 80,000 workers. Photovoltaics and wind farms and other renewables sector in Poland, it's around 100,000 people working there. So these proportions are changing, and I think slowly but steadily we'll get there.
Good data. Sure.
Just one word to add. Calculations have been made by one of the Polish think tanks, and I'm afraid I don't remember their name. However, it shows that the cost of shifting to renewable energy will be less expensive than refurbishing old installation, and the difference is about 1/3. So it is much more interesting, also from an economic point of view, to finance the transformation, the radical transformation of the economy, rather than refurbishing existing installations.
Mm-hmm. Georg, anything to add on that? Okay. Melissa.
Thank you. I think my job here is to give slightly different perspectives on things. So I thought I'd give a couple of perspectives and then I have a question. So first on that question you were just discussing, coal transition, that's something that clearly Australia has had to try to do. Politically, it's been very, very difficult, and it's been the thing that's stalled our green energy transition. But what's happened now is there's a sense of inevitability, and that's come from international markets, as in the companies, the international companies that buy up our coal-fired electricity plants say they're not viable. They don't actually work anymore. They're all going out of business, they're closing them down. Even our coal mining communities see the writing on the wall. They get that this isn't long term. There is a use-by date on how long you can sell coal to the world, and you've got to think about transition in exactly the sort of terms you've talked about, what it means for communities and a real future for communities. So the thing I was going to give my impression on is that question of the unity, the common actions or divisions. And I can just give you a perspective from Australia. From the outside, Europe looks amazingly coordinated on this, okay? And I'm saying that as a country that has been on the receiving end of at least a decade of European concerted action to try to get us to pull our weight on climate in the world. So whether that's the European External Action Service or the diplomatic services of each individual member, if it's in the EU-Australia Free Trade Agreement negotiations, we get constant unrelenting pressure from Europe as a bloc to do better. So for what it's worth, that's what I see common. My question was actually on loss and damage. So we've talked a bit about climate justice, and the way that's starting to be talked about in some of the international fora is loss and damage reparations, essentially, particularly for countries that won't be able to adapt, because there are limits to adaptation. We see that in the Pacific Islands, for example. If we are going beyond the 1.5 increase, which I think is now pretty much locked in, that's not survivable. I know what the US position is on loss and damage, which is absolutely not. I don't know what the European position is, and I'd be interested to hear that. Thank you.
Anybody wants to take this? Not really. I guess we don't know what our position on loss and damage is, although we did talk about that last night over dinner. No.
No, just a word. It has been one of the subjects in Glasgow also, and there have been some conclusions and some proposals that have been adopted, but it's rather still either at the exploratory phase, testing solutions, and also it's rather a limited club of actors. It is not yet something that is accepted by all the parties to the convention. So I think that discussions in a small club and testing of solutions is probably a necessary step before embarking more states in this avenue.
Before I take more questions from the audience, I'm drawn by what Melissa said about business transitioning, which puts pressure on the government. And I wonder if it's the right way, that we wait for business to change and then the government acts, or it should be the other way around. I actually had that question on my list, the role of government and public money. How, the role of the lobbies, coal lobby, fossil fuel lobby is known. It's incredible. How does a government withstand the pressure from a lobby, and what should be the government's role in mitigating and adapting to climate change?
Yeah, it's quite closely related to a topic that I have looked in quite a bit, which is industrial policy, and kind of is it the role of the companies themselves and of the business to decide where they want to go, or is there also a bit of a strategic directioning from the state that is helping to kind of bring countries into a direction that is future-proof? And I mean, I can speak of the German economic model, which is currently in deep trouble because we let essentially companies decide on the direction not only of the economy, but also then moved the foreign policy in line with what was needed for their business success. So for several decades, companies in Germany made a lot of money from buying cheap Russian energy, and we've discussed that before, and transforming that into high-value products and making a lot of money in the way. And that kind of, I mean, it was not always the case that Germany was that import-dependent on Russian energy. It was something that developed gradually over 5 decades, and in 1990, everybody believed Cold War is over and we can essentially erase all the security concerns here. And here I think some strategic consideration by the state on the direction of travel of the economy is needed. Now, why I'm saying that in relation to should we leave companies decide on climate policy, or should governments be in charge? And I am a strong believer that this is a joint action problem. So it's impossible to let companies do that. We see that in the coal sector, where Czech EPH is then buying off lignite plants and is running them. There will always be somebody who is wanting to squeeze more money out of the fossil infrastructure that is available. If we don't have the public sector that is coordinating limits for everyone and giving a direction, building out the infrastructure that is needed, building up the universities and that are needed to teach people the new technologies, it's not going to happen. So on this climate front, I strongly believe on the priority of government to make sure of that. And I mean, we have a lot of military today and yesterday, and it was quite fascinating to see that NATO was one of the first institutions that in the, I think, already 80s started to look into climate change as one of their new areas where they see a big security threat. So it is a security threat and it should be treated like that, and therefore government has a strong role here. Mm-hmm.
But very shortly, Geneviève, so we can take another...
I'm sorry, because yes, I should not speak too much, but you know, I have experienced so many fights with the lobbies that Georg has mentioned, and for so many decades that I just want to say a few words about the last battles. Presently, companies that in Europe have benefited during at least 10 years of free allocations of emission trading. So free allocation of CO2 emissions, if you wish so. They want to keep them, and they are fighting to keep them, but we know that, first of all, they have not used these free allocations as an incentive to change their technologies and to pollute less, not at all, quite the contrary. And they have enriched themselves with this free allocation. It's a bit technical. I could speak of that for a very long time, but I will spare your time, and just know that it is a real fight. And not only public authorities have to be aware of that and keep the bar of the general interest, but more and more big financial institutions help them in a very powerful manner by stopping, for instance, to finance coal companies, and more oil companies, and probably gas companies will come soon.
Zuzanna, I need to give you the opportunity to speak too.
Thank you. Just to add one last point, I think, I believe that one of the most important roles of the governments, of public authorities, is to make companies accountable of what they are doing, and really to bring transparent rules on what they should announce and in which way. This relates to the question, the big problem of right now selling coal assets. Big companies are getting rid of coal assets from their portfolios so that they can benefit from some funding for renewable energies. This is happening in Poland. This is happening in other countries in Europe, if there are some coal assets still working. But those companies who buy those assets, they don't care. They are not big public companies. They are not state-owned. They don't care about the rules. They don't care about the environment, about accountability. They do whatever they want. And this is the place for the state, for the governments, for the EU to intervene and to make them pay for what they are doing.
Thanks. You seem to be speaking in one voice, really, on actually all of the questions. Maybe it's just because we are all from the global north. Thank you very much. We're going to sum up the panel with Peter. I want to thank you myself.